Withology is about collaboration, inspiration, dedication, influence, and positive manifestation. It's about the stories behind success, something everyone needs a little bit of help achieving. Join host Brian Tierney, CEO of Brian Communications, as he interviews the most successful business and industry leaders to hear the fascinating stories about their personal journeys and the people who have helped them get to where they are today. Welcome to Withology.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Withology. I'm Brian Tierney, CEO of Brian Communications, and you've joined us for part one of a two-part interview with Robert Bob Brown. Friends call him Bob. He's Bob to me. He's a great guy. Bob is founder, chairman, and CEO of B&C Associates, a management consulting, market research, and public relations firm headquartered in High Point, North Carolina. I've had the pleasure of getting to know Bob through his involvement with the Horatio Alger Association, where he served on the board for more than 30 years. It's a tremendous organization. And Bob, in my opportunities to have conversations with him over the years, you become more and more aware of the incredible life that he has lived. And the details are in his new memoir, which is out now. It's called You Can't Go Wrong Doing Right, How a Child of Poverty Rose to the White House and Helped Change the World. You can get that book through Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and BAM Books A Million. Today we're going to talk about some of the hard truths that Bob learned about life from his grandmother growing up in the segregated South, his time with Dr. Martin Luther King at the very heart of the civil rights movement, his trip to South Africa with Coretta Scott King to visit Nelson Mandela in jail and the Mandela family, who he stays very close to this day, and what it was like to become one of the first non-family members to visit Nelson Mandela in prison in South Africa. Bob, it's a pleasure to have you with me today on Withology. Let's start at the beginning. You were raised in High Point, North Carolina. Your grandmother played such a critical role in helping shape who you are today. Talk a little about those early days.
Well, I grew up here in High Point, North Carolina, where I live now. This has always been my home. I've lived and had homes in other places around the world. But my grandmother, whose father was a slave in Anson County, North Carolina, she had her morals and her energetic spirit and her belief in God and what God could do for you was just unbelievable. And she talked about it all the time. I know when we were growing up, everything was very segregated. You couldn't go into a restaurant. You couldn't go get a hot dog, even from some drive-ins. They wouldn't let Black people go into drive-ins. She would always be saying that. She said, Bobby, God is going to work a way out. He's going to fix it. She said, you know this is wrong. And all of this is wrong. And she said, God is going to fix it. And she said, one of these days, you're going to be right in there helping the Lord to fix this thing. I remember going one day in a Woolworth store, and I started drinking water. I saw a water fountain. I started drinking water. I was about 5 years old, I guess. And she said, oh, get away from that fountain right there, Bobby. You can't drink that water. I said, Mama, this is water. She said, I know, but that's white water. They had a white water and they had colored water. Well, I didn't much know the difference. And she said, you drink from this fountain over here because this is colored water. I said, is there any difference between the water, Mama? She said, oh, no, it's all God's water. And she said, he's going to fix it after a while, Bobby. And how could I know that I would be one of the ones who would be helping to fix it? Only God can do that.
Your grandmother took you one time to the actual location of the slave mart where her father was last sold. How old were you at that time?
Right. I was about 9 years old, I guess, 9 or 10 years old. I was old enough to understand what was going on. And she said, we're going down to Wadesboro. And then we went to the bus station to get tickets with my brother. And she told the lady, she said, I want to go by way of Fayetteville. And I'd like to change buses there. And the lady said, oh, no problem. And so we got the tickets and went to Fayetteville. My grandmother said, oh, look, we're getting off of this bus. We're going to change buses here. And we had a layover for about an hour. And she said, I want to walk you boys down the street here a little ways. And so she went to the window and asked the lady, she said, where is that old marketplace here? How far is that down the street? She said, oh, no, it's just right down the street, maybe 2 blocks, 3 blocks, not far. She said, just go out there and walk straight down the street, go left. And we walked down there and we went to this old building, a brick, a rock, or something, and it was whitewashed. And she said, I just wanted to bring you boys here to show you where my father was sold for the last time. I will never forget it. It was just, I couldn't believe it when she was saying that. And she said, my father was sold here, and we were all raised over in Anson County, and that's where the people who bought him, that's where they lived. And then when he was freed, he continued to live there, and we built an old house and everything. It just has an imprint in my mind, in my psyche, that I can never forget.
She must have been amazing to stay optimistic and positive, and obviously her faith was a big driver in terms of kind of her compass. Tell me more about your grandmother.
She was a magnificent woman. She believed in love. She said, you have to love everybody, Bobby, even if they hate you. You have to love them. But she was also a strong woman. And, everybody knew her. She was a gospel singer. She could sing every gospel song there was in the book. And she would go around, and we would go around to different churches, and everybody knew her because she was a stand-up person. And she didn't let anybody run over her, but she always believed in what was right. That's the way she lived her life. And it left an indelible imprint on my own life. I mean, she was the one who gave me courage and energy when life was absent of that for Black people.
So you graduate from high school and college, and then you became a police officer. You felt you could make a difference in a positive way doing that. Talk about that, and we'll take you to New York, too, where you later went on to be a federal agent.
Well, I graduated from high school. I went to college for 2 years. I went to North Carolina A&T for a year, and which was right next door. I would ride a bus and thumb ride to get to school because there was no other way for me. I didn't have a way. So I went there for a year, and then I went to Virginia Union University in Richmond for a year. I was a fairly good student. I made mostly A's and everything. But after my second year of college, I decided that I had to get out and get a job or do something because my grandmother and my grandfather, who were raising me, were both ill. So after that, I was a policeman. I stayed a policeman for 2 years. During that time, I met 2 federal narcotic agents who came to this area because there was a lot of dope floating around and they needed some help. And the chief assigned me to help them. And so I helped them, and we were very successful in rounding up some people who were selling drugs. And the guy who was in charge, the agent in charge, Jack Kelly, he said, look, we need somebody like you in the bureau. He said, we only have 1 or 2 Black agents in the whole bureau in the whole country. And he said, we need you, Bob. And he said, I'm going to send you some papers. You fill them out, send them back to me. He sent me the papers a few days later. I filled them out, sent them back. I didn't think I'd ever hear anything. And in a few weeks, about 3 weeks later, my grandmother calls the police station. I called her back. She said, come by here. I went by her house, and she said, that afternoon, she said, look, a lot of people are telling me that the police are investigating you, some federal people. And are you in any trouble, boy?
It's all good, Mom.
I said, no, Mom, I'm not in any trouble. So I had to fess up and tell her what was going on. And she said, how you going to leave town? You got a good job as a policeman. And I said, well, Mama, there's a possibility they want me to take a job as a federal agent in New York. She said, Lord, have mercy. How in the world you going to go way up there in New York? I said, well, it'll be a better job. It'll be a great advancement for me. And so I ended up taking the job, and my late wife and I moved to New York. And we lived there for, I guess, about 3 years. And I became a federal narcotic agent working all over the country, working in Canada. I testified in the Vito Genovese case, which was the biggest mafia case in the history of the country. I went to Canada and arrested the biggest guys in the drugs in Canada and testified before the Royal Canadian courts there over a period of time. And then after a couple of years or so, it didn't seem like I was going anywhere. I made the biggest cases and everything else and wasn't getting the raises that some of the guys around me who happened to be different skin color than I was were getting. I said, no, I don't want to do this anymore. So I decided one day that I was going to come back to North Carolina and open up a public relations business.
That's amazing. So, and it's also the being open to new things, reading. You're a voracious reader. I know you read newspapers, and we were talking about that too. I like reading. I read online all the time, but I love the printed paper because somebody's already curated it and said, this is the most important stuff. Just check it out. And you read several a day, don't you, Bob?
That's right.
Yeah.
I read New York Times, Wall Street Journal. I read a lot of the black papers, the black newspapers. I listen to the news. I watch the news. I keep up with a whole host of sources for intelligence and things that's going on in various communities all over the world.
Yeah, it's funny because sometimes people will say, how do you know so much? And I just say, I read. You read that times 10. I mean, I just find that's just interesting, and you bring it back to your work, and you're able to advise clients based upon it and things like that. So when you started your business, you quickly pick up great clients, like we were saying, like FW Woolworths and A&P supermarkets and things like that. You've got the background in terms of being a federal agent. You now have this communications firm. You meet Dr. Martin Luther King and you're advising him on communications. You became a member of his board, his executive committee. You help him kind of fundraise too as well. Talk about that. How did you first meet Dr. King?
Well, I met him. I was in Atlanta meeting with Stan Scott. His family owned the Atlanta Daily World, a black newspaper in Atlanta. Had been there for decades. And we were having lunch. And he said, Wyatt Walker is sitting over here at the other table. He said, do you know him? I said, no. I said, I know who he is, but I don't know him. He was running Dr. King's organization, SCLC. And he had been a student at Virginia Union, where I spent a year, and I had met him there. He was a graduate student. He was graduating when I went there. And I'd met him just briefly. And so he brought him over, and he said, Bob, I want you to meet Reverend Walker. We talked a few minutes, and he said, what are you doing? And I told him I was in the public relations business, and I was working with some companies and this, that, and the other. And he said, well, you need to come on up to SCLC office a couple of blocks up the street and meet Dr. King. He said, have you ever met Dr. King before? I said, very briefly once in New York, but I don't know him. He said, you come on. He said, I'll tell him you coming. He's in the office today. So when we got through with late breakfast, I went on up there. Dr. King was like he was standing there waiting on me inside his office. I got there and they ushered me right on in his office. And Wyatt introduced me to him. And he said, oh, I'm glad to know you. And Wyatt told me a little bit about you and you working with a few companies. And he said, we need your help real bad, Bob. He said, we don't have no money. We are desperate, man. We trying to make it. And he said, every time we turn one corner, see there's somebody there blocking the road for us. And I said, well, I'll be ready and able to help any way I can, Doc. You're doing something for America and for this world. And he said, well, I need money. I need help. He said, I need advice from time to time. And I said, I will help in every way that I can. So I just went right out and started raising money. And after a while, he said, you got to stay with me, Bob. I need you real bad. He said, you can open doors and you can do a lot of things I can't do. And so I started raising money from different companies and different people and doing a lot of other kinds of things in these communities. And then he said, I want you on my board. So he put me on his board of directors, on his executive committee. And then from time to time, I would travel with him and meet him different places.
When you're with Dr. King, I mean, what would someone who was sitting there with him take away? You're talking about one of the most important people in American history or world history in the last 100 years. I mean, what was he like up close? Just talk about that a little bit.
He was very kind, very playful. And he was also an extremely serious man. I know one of the times that he called me, he was in Cleveland, and this is in the Smithsonian Institute. He talked about it in his speech later that night. he said, Bob, he called me. He said, I'm desperate. He said, man, I'm out here in Cleveland. And he said, I'm working on a situation and with seal tests. He said, they won't hire no black milk truck drivers. They won't advertise in black news. They won't do anything. And they won't even meet with me, Bob. And he said, I don't know what to do. We don't have no money to have a whole lot of demonstrations right now. And I don't know what to do. I said, my back is against the wall. He said, and I need your advice and your help. I said, well, let me think about this and I'll call you back later on this evening. And so I decided to get on a plane, next plane out of High Point to New York. And I went to the airport, got on the next plane, and I went to see the chairman of the board of A&P Stores. A&P was one of my clients. They were the largest supermarket chain in America at the time. And I told him his secretary was an emergency. I need to see him. So I went there to see him, and he let me right on in his office. He said, Bob, sit down. What's the problem? I said, well, we got a big problem in Cleveland, Ohio. I said, Dr. King is there, and he's trying to meet with the seal test dairy people, and they won't meet with him, and he is running short on money, and they don't have no money to start a big demonstration campaign, and he doesn't know what to do. I said, it could have a lot of trouble if they start going and it gets out of control. I said, we'll be right in the middle of it because where the seal test sell most of his milk in A&P stores.
Right.
And so he said, you're right. He said, what should we do, Bob? I said, you should get hold of the chairman of the board of seal test and tell him that if they don't talk to Dr. King and settle this thing with Dr. King, that you are going to take all of the seal test products out of all the stores in the city of Cleveland, Ohio. And I said, that will generate some movement. And he says, yeah, I think so. So he called in one of his top guys and he told him, he said, well, seal test has this problem that could be a problem of ours. And he said, we don't need this. He said, I want you to call that, he said another kind of word, chairman of seal test. And you tell him that if they don't get in touch with Dr. King immediately, we're going to take all the seal test products out of all of the A&P stores in the state of Ohio. I recommended that they say something about the city of Cleveland. He told him, tell them state of Ohio. So I told him I thought that would work out okay and that the company would be in front of this situation where it needed to be. And so I said, I got to get on back to North Carolina. He said, thank you very much, Bob. I left. By the time I got to the airport, I called my office and they said, Mr. Brown, Dr. King has been desperately trying to reach you and he needs you to call him immediately. So we didn't have cell phones back then. So I called Dr. King at the number he left. And he picked up the phone and I said, Martin, what's going on? He said, Bob, what in the world did you tell those people at A&P? He said, the chairman of the board of seal test is desperately trying to reach me. He said, he done called me about 20 times. I told my people I wouldn't talk to him until I talked to you because I don't know what's going on. And so I told him what happened. And he said, my Lord. He said, this ain't nothing but God at work.
Yes.
And he said, well, I'm going to go ahead and call him now. I said, well, I'll talk to you later on this afternoon. Well, he called him. And later on that afternoon, I talked to Martin again. And Martin said, Bob, you can't even imagine what happened. He said, those people at Seal Test want to meet. They want to work with us. They want to give us milk truck drivers. They want to open up everything to black people, advertise in black newspapers and magazines, everything. He said, what on earth? He said, that ain't nothing but God at work.
Yeah.
So that night, he held a mass rally in Cleveland, which is in the Smithsonian, his speech and everything. And he talks about what happened. And he says, in the speech, he says, Seal Test was all high and mighty. He said, but Seal Test didn't realize that one of our board members was Bob Brown. And Bob also worked with the A&P people, the biggest supermarket people in the world. And all of a sudden, Bob got up, went to New York, and worked it out. And then his chairman trying to reach me a million times. Now, this speech is in the Black History Museum in Washington.
Wow.
Anybody in the world can get it and listen to it. It's not my word. I'm telling you what, Dr. King, I don't have time to tell you all of what he said, but it was something else.
That's amazing. I mean, that role of being that trusted advisor and making things happen because people respect you, the CEO and you chairman of Woolworth respects you enough, you can get right in, you can open up doors then for Dr. King, and you can help people find this common ground because you're breaking through barriers that they have in their own head or that other people are putting around them. That's an amazing story, Bob. If people don't close off themselves to opportunities and you always are, people meet you, they respect you, they're saying that's really a good man, a smart man. And then that leads to this in ways that you wouldn't even,
I can't explain it. I don't know. I mean, who?
The hand of God.
I go to Africa. I didn't ask to go to Africa. One of my clients, the Sierra Leone Corporation, had a big problem there. They had bought a company that had several factories over there and had a big operation. And they hadn't thought too much about it at the time. And the company was Nicholas Kiwi, the shoe polish company and all that. That was owned by them. And they had a couple of big factories and they had a lot of people. So as soon as that deal was finalized, they started getting all kind of threatening calls into the headquarters in Chicago. And the chairman, John Bryan, called me. He said, Bob, you got to look into this immediately. You got to go to South Africa and find out what the hell is going on and what our operation like. They hadn't even seen the operation in South Africa. So I said, okay. So he sent Bob Elverson, who was the president of Sierra Leone, with me on that trip. Well, on the trip, on the way over there, because they were having demonstrations, they were killing people and everything else. It was a whole nother world. And I had seen that world to some extent because I grew up in it, in the South.
Right.
It was another world. And that's when I started meeting all these different people and one thing. And then I got involved emotionally in it because I remembered what we had gone through.
Yeah.
And one thing after another, I started helping this group and that group and meeting with different people and all that. And then Mrs. King, Coretta King, called me one day and she said, Bob, I want to go to South Africa. She said, we want to see what we can do. And she said, I can't get a visa because they won't give me a visa. And back then they were very, they wouldn't give civil rights visa, anybody like that, no visa to go to South Africa. So I called the ambassador, Pete Kornoff, who I had met, and he had professed to me that he was a good Christian. And so I told him, I said, Pete, Mrs. King just called me and said she can't get a visa to South Africa. And he said, well, Bob, that's the way things are sometimes over there and so forth. I said, we met at a prayer breakfast, man. You told me you were a Christian. I said, Christians don't act like that.
Good for you.
And I said, you need to change that thing up, man. And, because I'm with Mrs. King. And he said, well, don't do nothing erratic, Bob. He said, I'll call him and everything. He said, I'll call you back tomorrow and see what we can do. Next day, he called me back. He said, Bob, I talked to him over there, and they'll give a visa to Mrs. King and her party if you will come with them. I said, okay, I'll be there right there with them by outside. So, of course, we got visas for everybody who want to come.
Right.
And she made her first trip into South Africa. And that's when I met Winnie Mandela.
And this is mid-'80s, right? This was like around 84, 85, 86, something like that?
Yeah, it was in the 80s. That's right.
Because Mandela is still in jail at that point.
Mandela was in jail. Oh, yeah. Absolutely. He was in jail.
So you're going over with Mrs. King to meet Mrs. Mandela.
Uh-huh. We met a lot of people. We went to meet Ms. Mandela and me and Mrs. King and her son and Barbara Skinner, Reverend Barbara Skinner.
Mm-hmm.
Ms. Mandela told us that the main thing that they wanted to see, there were two things. They would like to get Mr. Mandela out of jail if that was humanly possible. But the other thing is that she and Mr. Mandela wanted was their children to be able to leave South Africa and come and go to school in America. And she said her daughter, Zanani, and her husband, who they were living, and her grandchildren were living next door in a small country there. and they were able to go if somebody would help. And Ms. King looked at me and she said, "Bob, is this something we can do?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, I'll take care of it," and which I did.
Yeah.
I told them to send me all the information, and I brought them to America, paid for it, paid for their schooling. They were here for me for 7 years. They went to Boston University, where John Silver was president, and I was on that board for many years, and they graduated. But by the time they graduated 7 years later, Mr. Mandela was just getting out of jail. It was a whole nother, the world started to change.
Yeah.
But during that time, they were over here. I got them, they had a house. I took care of them.
You rented the house for them, didn't you? Yeah.
I rented a house, cost me $6,000 a month for a house, and took care of them, fed them, clothed them, everything for 7 years. It cost me a lot of money, but I didn't mind it because I thought this was something that the good Lord wanted me to do. They had suffered so much, the family, and I like Mr. Mandela. They let me go inside the prison to see him. I'm the first and only person to see him besides his immediate family.
What were the conditions like when you went into that prison and you see him? I mean, what is it like?
Well, I went to the prison there, and I went to the gate, and they had 2 or 3 guys with big guns and a big gate there on the gate, on the outside the gate. And they said, "Halt!" And I said, "Oh, God, here they can kill me." I said, "I could be tired." So I put my hands up and had my passport. And I said, "Here's my passport." And they looked at my passport, and the guy started reading. He says, "You, Mr. Brown?" I said, "Yes, sir." And he says, "Oh, Mr. Brown is here." And he told the guy up top, way up top there, and they had a cage up top there with big guns in it. And he says, "Open the gate. Mr. Brown is here." So they opened the gate. And then when the gate opened, he said, "Mr. Brown, you go to that red brick building. You walk to that red brick building right up there." And he said, "When you get there, there will be somebody there to meet you. Somebody will come out and meet you." I said, "Oh," and I'm praying all the way because I just, I halfway knew that they were going to kill me. I would never live to get out of there because they were killing people back then.
Yeah.
So I walked on up there and praying all the way. So I walked up there, and when I got up to that door and close to the door, it was a little couple of brick steps. And when I got up to the steps, the door opens, boom, just like that. I said, "Oh, Lord, this is it." And this guy steps out, this big, tall, white guy steps out with a cap on and his braids on his cap. And he stuck his hand out. He said, "Mr. Brown." I said, "Yes, sir." He says, "I'm the chief warden here. And I just want to say, I want to shake your hand because I want to thank you for what you're doing for Mr. Mandela and his family." He said, "You come on in." And he said, "You go into that room over there to the right." He said, "There'll be some chairs in there, and you can sit in there and talk to him as long as you please." He said, "We're having him brought down from his cell right now, and you just make yourself at home. Talk to him as long as you want to."
Yeah.
And I was shocked because his family, he had been in jail for 20-some years, and his own family had not seen him for more than 15 minutes at a time. They would travel 2,500 miles. So Mandela came down. He thanked me for all that I was doing and everything else. He hugged me, and I hugged him, and so we just started talking, and we talked about everything, things there in the country, about America, and about he had read about Dr. King and Mrs. King, and he wanted to know if I knew them, and I told him that Martin Luther King was one of my closest friends, and I had been on his board and worked with him, and Mrs. King was a close friend. And he asked me about people, about situations, about what they ought to be doing in South Africa and all of that. So it was an unbelievable meeting.
Bob, that must have been an unbelievable, unforgettable, once-in-a-generation experience for you. Having just helped Coretta Scott King take her first trip to South Africa, you're sitting down with one of the most influential leaders in the world certainly in South Africa, and talk about your friendship with Dr. Martin Luther King and his wife, who because of you had just met Mandela's wife and family for the first time. Unbelievable is right. What an incredible moment. And who knew that Nelson Mandela would one day get out of jail and become the president of South Africa? I bet you some of that advice came in handy later on. That's all the time we have for today, but we'll get back into more of Bob's time with other world leaders in part 2 of this interview. Bob, I know you have a lot more to share, and we'll get into your time with Bobby Kennedy and President Richard Nixon in the next conversation. Part 2 of the interview is coming soon. Everyone, please stay tuned. Thank you for joining us for part 1 of episode 4 of Withology with Bob Brown.